This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
Every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. And of course, you are always invited to support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and becoming a patron. A little goes a long way.
Today we welcome Professor Shachar Pinsker. He's a specialist in modern Hebrew and Jewish literature and culture, especially Hebrew literature written in Palestine, Israel, Europe and America, as well as Jewish literature in Yiddish, English, German and other languages. He has a joint appointment at the Department of Middle East Studies and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Today we'll be talking about his second book. The third is in progress, but this one is called A Rich Brew, How Cafés Created Modern Jewish Culture. It was published last year by New York University Press. Professor Shachar Pinsker, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Now, this is, Dali and I were just saying, it's the most succinct opening question I think we've ever had. Why cafes?
Why cafes? That's a very good question. It's a question I ask myself
Gilad is
very
getting a
often.
big pat on the back right now.
Right. Yeah, and the truth is that I, as a literary scholar, this is a very big question for me because it's not anything obvious. And yet, anyone who has read Jewish literature in all these languages, Hebrew, Yiddish, German, and many others, will see that cafes really appear so many times in so many novels and poems and short stories, and maybe that's the first thing that kind of piqued my interest. And to tell you the truth, many, many years ago, again, as a literary scholar, I thought, it's just setting, and that's it. The next stage for me was really kind of thinking as a literary scholar, but also as a cultural historian, to see, what goes on outside the books, outside literature? Did people really went there? Why was it so important for them? So that's how I came to it. I suppose that other people, for different reasons, would be attracted to cafes for other reasons. Actually, and I am too, because I love these places.
The truth comes out. That's what it really comes from. Let me ask you this.
But why cafes and not other institutions or other public places?
Yeah, so what kind of other?
I don't know, universities, public parks, I don't know, bookshops.
Synagogues. I mean, you mentioned the contrast with
right.
places with
Right.
synagogues.
So, these are all important spaces and important walk, intellectual walk, and social meetings and, happening in all these places. But the cafe is different, and it's a little hard to explain why. You need to go into, some of it is subjective, why I like to walk in cafes, why I like to read in cafes rather than in other places. It doesn't always make sense, Part of it is the food and drink. You don't have that in synagogues. You don't have that in other places, of course, so that's a big draw. Some of it is the noise and the fact that there are other people, Yeah, so there are all kind of reasons, and I think that the cafe, is definitely similar to many other spaces, but it's also distinct. So that's part of the whole question of why the cafe and how it evolved and, what are the similarities and differences between the cafe and other spaces.
Let's talk about cafes and Jews. Your book makes the argument that they play a particular role in the life of the Jewish community in this sort of modern period of increasingly cosmopolitan life and diasporic life. But do we know that they were important for Jews in a way that was distinct from how important they were to any other intellectual community? You mentioned yourself, that Pushkin's enthusiasm for the cafes of Odessa, Chekhov was a visitor. I think of Hemingway sitting in scribbling rooms, cafes in Paris. Why were cafes any different for Jews than for any other intellectuals, since your book is focused on intellectuals?
By the way, not only intellectuals. So one of the reasons why is that, even those places that are known as literary cafes, there's no one that says only writers are allowed, there's always the mixture, right? And the mixture is actually a key. And I think that's the reason why also the importance of cafes for Jews, and that's, I claim, is really kind of part of modernity, part of Jewish modernity, because obviously cafes are modern, first of all, right? And they didn't come to Europe. They didn't come to places where Jews were, part of the urban scene until modernity, right? And that was exactly the time where the question of what does it mean to be Jewish changed, right? So obviously cafes were never purely Jewish. There was nothing Jewish about coffee. There was nothing Jewish about the space of the cafe. And that's why I don't think we can think about cafe in the early modern period or it's something that really came together with modernity, and Jews became very attracted to cafes for all kind of reasons, Part of it was really in Christian Europe and also in other places when you think about the alternatives. So, what were the places where people met? Normally there were places, clubs or taverns, and places where alcohol was at the center. And it's not the Jews didn't drink alcohol, didn't like alcohol, they did, but they didn't feel comfortable. Very often they were not invited. And
Come on, we're notoriously bad drinkers.
Right,
Can we admit
right.
it?
Of course. But if you go back to the 17th and 18th century, for Jews to come in Berlin or in Vienna to a tavern, even in Poland, where many Jews, there's actually a whole book about it, about Jews owning taverns, and Bialik's family, for example, they owned a tavern. But they owned it, but that doesn't mean that the meeting between other Jews and between Jews and non-Jews took place in that. So, that kind of distinction, and the fact that the coffee house was known as a tavern without wine, right? And it was also known as a penny university in the early period, really attracted Jews, because it was exactly in this time when Jews were coming out of the ghetto, were coming out of what does it mean to be Jewish, and kind of looking for alternative, looking for point of entrance into the wider world, and coffee house became very attractive.
When I was reading the book, I kept thinking about Habermas until you actually mentioned him. Only briefly, but also he famously described the coffee shops in 18th century England, I think, as even before 17th century England, as really the genesis of modern political culture, the public sphere that has grown exponentially since. But this is where it all started. Where do you differ from his argument, or conversely, is your research, the evidence you present, in many ways vindication of Habermas's claim?
So I think the answer is yes and no. On one hand, I said before that it wasn't natural for me to really come to write about coffee houses. And in the beginning, I thought it's not really academic enough, But then when I read Habermas and I saw how people write about, then it really attracted me. So Habermas and the whole idea of the public sphere is very important. And I think that, it's true that when you look at the 18th and even 19th century, which for Habermas is a period of decline, coffee houses were really important for political culture, right? And Jews were in the middle of all of that, right? At the same time, we know that Habermas actually is not a historian. He's not a literary scholar, he's a philosopher and sociologist, and it's a kind of a model. And we know that in reality, it's really an ideal, the coffee house as the public sphere, as something that has access to everybody, and people can meet and talk, and there's no hierarchy. We know that it doesn't exist. On one hand, the coffee house is really this wonderful place that is open to everybody. You only need to buy a cup of coffee if you have enough money, and not all these people had enough money, even for one cup of coffee. But then we know that in terms of the intellectual, the habitués, the people who are inside there and outside there, who can be in, who can be out, it's a lot more complicated. So, on one hand, I rely on Habermas, and I think everybody who writes in coffee houses rely on this idea, very important idea of the public sphere. At the same time, we see the problems behind it. So,
does the fact that you're a literary scholar fit into that research in a particular way?
Yeah, I think so. It's really kind of...
Because you're not a historian either. You are a cultural historian, but your corpus is a literary text.
Yeah. I think it does, and that's why I introduced this idea that is actually coming from cultural geography of the third space, of really, I think really in order to understand... It took me a long time for me to understand it, that in order to really understand the coffee houses and what happened there and how people experienced it, you need to look at history, let's say, as many facts as we can about these specific places, where they were, what they looked like, what was the architecture, who were the owners, and then we have how people experienced it. Where do you find it?
What is this third space? I wanted you to try to clarify that. I know you said it took you a long time, but let's see if we can make it comprehensive for our listeners in a short time.
Yeah, I think in the most simple way, we can think about the third space as a kind of lived space, something that is real and imaginary at the same time.
That feels to me like all of life.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why this term is really coming from cultural geography, not just about the coffee house, about spaces and how we experience spaces. But I think it's particularly true for the coffee house. And that's why, if I was just a historian, I would probably take all these literary texts and put them on the side just as one, small source. But for me, the literature really gives you the best way of understanding what was the experience of the space of the coffee house. And I think that putting together whatever materials I could find in the archives or in newspapers or together with those poems and novels and stories really give a very rich kind of understanding of how people experience these places.
In the introduction, you write at a certain point that cafe culture and modernism are inextricably linked. And this gets to what you're talking about, that there's a certain realm of modern ideas that come out of this period. But you actually say that they're as important to modernism as publishing houses and journals. And I guess my question is, are they really as important as the journals and the publishing houses? I mean, you would think that if there's a demand of ideas or a demand for ideas and, social forces are churning, wouldn't those things get written if there's the publications that will publish them? Wouldn't they get written anywhere? Or did we really need the coffee houses to produce this modernity?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think I can think of two answers. First of all, the fact is that, and this goes back to Habermas as well, the newspapers and journals and all print culture actually connected to coffee houses, to the rise of coffee houses. We can't imagine the beginning of print without the coffee houses. Okay, this goes back to, so it's that important, right? Then when we jump forward to the 19th century and early 20th century, which is really kind of the heart of modernism, of course, the journals are really important, but why people went back, why writers went back to coffee houses and why they were always connected to these journals. And I don't think anyone has really a good answer to that. But the fact is that people were always attracted to it. I found so often, I have many examples of this in the book. Young writers coming to a new city, they want to meet the editor of a journal or a newspaper because they read it in the small town where they came from. And they want to meet them. And where do they meet them? In the coffee house. And they're amazed. This is where you sit and walk, or this is why is it that people are so attracted? And, there's all kind of reasons for it. Sometimes people go to a particular coffee house in order to have a distinct identity as a modernist group. And we see that in the book. There are many, many examples where people move from one cafe to the other, and we think, why? It's kind of childish, but they want to get away from a specific group and establish their own identity. And their own identity is all about ideas about the kind of literature that they want and how distinct it is. But how does it actually come into being? By moving from one cafe to another.
To me, the way I read the book was that it's really not a story about coffee shops, but a story about migration, about urbanism, about cultural integration, because many of the protagonists in your book are people who have come from elsewhere and going to other places. There's a lot of movement that really characterized this type of people at the time. So the cafes were just a symbol, perhaps, or a case study, but just a very concrete one, one with an actual physical presence that you could somehow demarcate, which, going back to your question, Dalia, maybe like the so-called Republic of Letters was perhaps too amorphous.
So here I think there is something, first of all, you're right.
Good answer.
No, it really is a way of looking and understanding modern Jewish culture as multilingual, as transnational, as constantly moving. And, the idea of migration and networks of migration, which is not a new idea, but I think there's something both in Jewish literature and in Jewish history in the way we, somebody is born in a specific place, then they immigrate to New York or to Tel Aviv, and that's it, But that's not the way it works. The way it works is that people are constantly moving, and the culture itself is constantly moving. And even when people immigrate, it doesn't mean that they stop moving. They go in between, and these coffee houses, that's why I'm using this metaphor of the Silk Road, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the coffee houses are really, I came to understand it when I saw people moving between cities and comparing all the time. They're obsessed with comparison, They say, Café Cassit in Tel Aviv is just like Café Zhimianska and Café Royal in New York, And obviously, it's true, but it's also not, because every city and every coffee house has its own character. But it becomes clear to you that these people, they are constantly moving, and the ideas are moving from one place to another, but it's not, from point A to point B. It's a network, and these ideas and the literature around it is moving. The people themselves are moving, right? And the coffee houses are really kind of this nexus, these points on a Silk Road. So in a sense, you can say that it's really, it is about the coffee house, but also the coffee house is a kind of portal or nexus to something.
As the general, and urbanization in general, right? The development of an urban culture for anybody.
Right.
I like what you said before about the idea that each cafe kind of develops its own identity, and you were talking about in a literary sense, but in the book you also talk about in a political sense, which, of course, I can't ignore that. You talk about one Odessa cafe that was actually bombed because of its perceived politics. There were cafes associated with radicals and with anti-Bolsheviks. What is this? How does the political image evolve, and how does it overlap with the literary ideas?
Yeah. So politics is always part of the story. It goes back to the history of coffee houses. It goes back to the fact that in the 18th and 19th century, in the age of empires, coffee houses were places where they were seen as less dangerous, and therefore many revolutions were actually planned in coffee houses.
Oh, because nobody suspected them as being hotbeds of radicalism?
Yeah. Okay.
Until
people understood that actually they are, and then there are some stories about people who are actually working for the, so that happened as well. But the same way that we spoke before about modernism and more from literary point of view, that certain groups had identity, it was also politically. So, when Emma Goldman, for example, came to New York City from upper New York, from a small town, she was immediately taken to a place that was known as a hotbed of radicalism and anarchism, and that's the place that opened her eyes to all these ideas. So, for her it was very important. There are many, many other places where people say, okay, this particular place is really identified with a specific political movement. But, at the same time, it's also like the whole idea of the Habermas idea is the cafe as a bourgeois place, So it can be both. It can be a place of, because after all, it's a place of commodity. It's a place of, people buying and selling, and it's a business. But in a way, people appropriate the space in order to do radical politics. And that's part of the contradiction that makes it so interesting and so alive.
Your book focuses on 6 case studies, 6 cities where Jewish cafes were all the rage. You, I think, rely on the formulation of Dan Miron, that the history of Jewish literature is contiguous rather than continuous. How does the choice of these 6 case studies that really chronologically, geographically are quite disparate highlight that formulation for you?
Yeah. Okay, so, the truth is that the book could go on and on and on and on. And, other people are actually doing it. So people are writing about coffee houses in Paris and Prague and Budapest, obviously. And then also, I focused mostly on the Ashkenazi world, but people are writing about cafes in Baghdad and in Cairo. And, so I had to choose. I knew that I can't go on forever. The choice for me was really about what we spoke about before, this migration and the network of migration. And I wanted to show 2 cities in Eastern Europe, Odessa and Warsaw, 2 in Central Europe, Vienna and Berlin, and then New York in the New World in America, and Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Tel Aviv. I wanted to write about Jerusalem originally, but then it only made it in the beginning and the end. And, it's limited. it's not arbitrary, the fact that Eastern Europe, Central Europe, America, and it's quite, it's selective, but it's also representative. It's also, it was really important for me that these places were nexus of meetings for people who are immigrants and also the multilingual aspect, right? And that happened in all these cities. Whereas, for example, in Paris maybe, or in Prague, or in other places, this meeting was not so intense. But, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody will write and show that exactly what happened in other places.
Maybe one of our listeners now.
I'll be very happy if this project will grow by, with other people, and there's going to be more. I think it's a wonderful way of mapping modern Jewish culture, and the more, the better.
Let's talk about my favorite subject of all, which is Tel Aviv. Okay, because you have a chapter on Tel Aviv, and how do you see the cafes of Tel Aviv today, in the sense that I'm thinking about, we all we live here, and I dare say both Gilad and I probably spend quite a bit of time in cafes. And, I'm thinking about this in some ways revolutionary aspect that you're talking about. And I don't just mean politically revolutionary, but the revolutionary idea of creating a modern Jewish spirit, or creating a modern, artist and intellectual culture, whether it's Jewish or not Jewish, in cafes. And the cafes in Tel Aviv today, they're a lot of fun, but do they really have this same revolutionary role of creating a sociological identity, cultural identity, a political dissenting force, or are they just a place to get a good
and maybe, in going back to what you're saying, in retrospect, there was a certain dimension of idealization of what was going on in the cafes that you...
Yeah, did they know it at the time, that they were so revolutionary?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of questions going around here. One of them is about Tel Aviv and Jaffa as a very unique place, because, we didn't speak about it so much, but coffee and coffee houses actually did not start in Europe. They started in the Middle East,
point that out.
In the Muslim context. And Tel Aviv, or rather Jaffa, is actually a place where, these European Jews are coming to, and they go and they find coffee houses in Jaffa, Arab coffee houses, and they say, what is it? This is not what we are used to in Europe. But then some of them who know the history of coffee houses, and Agnon is one of them, that's why he's using the word beta kahava, the Arabic word, they know that there is a paradox there. So I think that's one of the elements that make Tel Aviv unique in this book, right? So that's one thing. Then there is the element of Tel Aviv with its own... if coffee houses in Europe and in America were really very important for diasporic culture, what people tried to do in Tel Aviv was exactly the opposite, to build something that will be different and unique. And for some people, it was exactly to move away from this world of the coffee house Jew, as Herzl, for example, and other people, So it was very controversial in the beginning whether Tel Aviv will have coffee houses or not. But then it only took 20 years that Tel Aviv had so many. Now, when we come to today, I think it's also quite unique, because you go to New York, you go to other places. Tel Aviv thinks of itself as having a thriving cafe culture in a way that doesn't exist in other places around the world.
New York, definitely, because I have to tell a personal anecdote that after I moved to Israel, with the first year or two, my mother came to visit, and she's a hard, driving New Yorker, dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker, as we say, and she looked around, she said, what are all these people doing in the cafes in the middle of the day? Right. Why aren't they working? Right. And I said, Mom, this is how life works here. Right. But I couldn't explain it exactly. So I think in some ways there really is a contrast.
And also another anecdote to add to Tel Avivians' famous cafe snobbery or coffee snobbery is the fact that Starbucks went bust in Israel. I think it's the only country in the world and existed very briefly. I always say that this is one of the very few times that I really felt proud to be Israeli.
Right. But this goes to something
that is subversive right here in the studio.
Yeah, no. I know that, and I don't live in Tel Aviv anymore, but I love Tel Aviv, and I come back here, and I like sitting in cafes here and to see how the cafe culture here evolves. But my book really ends. Okay, in Europe, it ends with World War II. That's not a surprise. Then, when I write about New York and Tel Aviv, what I found really fascinating is that in both cities, for similar but different reasons, what I'm talking about really ends in the 60s and 70s. right? And then you come to today or to the years between the 1970s and today, and there's a paradox there. On one hand, there's more coffee houses today than there've been in the period that I write about. On the other hand, it's really difficult. Maybe, tell me, maybe I'm wrong, but I wrote about it in the end. In the conclusion, I can think maybe of one or two examples where you can really see writers and intellectuals and people meeting, and the coffee house is really important for them. So I think, people still like it. I still like it. People meet there, but less and less so. If people meet, it's just a place outside the apartment, to meet, or more and more it becomes a place for people on their own laptop to do some work, but they're really renting a space rather than inhabiting it in the way that was. And again, I don't want to be nostalgic, because in coffee houses, it wasn't just a place of meeting and exchange of ideas. It was also a place of many, many, many tensions, right? But I think that this element of really the cafe is a place of meeting, of ideas, it's gone, and it's gone everywhere around the world.
Is this the time I can ask the question about the revolutionary podcast I listened to? Okay, I just heard a podcast, which I should give it the props. It's On Being by Krista Tippett, and they interviewed the Indigo Girls. And they talked about how in the 1960s and 70s, all those social protest movements were largely driven and really associated with protest music. Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and these people who really wrote the anthems. And even the Indigo Girls, who were very socially activist, were explaining that there just isn't that kind of music anymore that really drives and expresses the subversive and, society-changing kinds of role ideas. And I'm just wondering if maybe there's relevance here because the cafes themselves are expressing maybe a broader social moment that we're in, where we have lots of problems and lots of movements and lots of clashes and lots of fear of, changing politics, but maybe we haven't quite figured out how to harness a revolutionary spirit. And it's not only in cafes, but also in music and maybe in literature. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, these are big questions. And
that's what we're here for.
Yeah, no, I think there is something in this observation that in music and in literature and, these kind of revolutionary, we live in a different world and everything seems to be so confused now. And the fact that we have technology and things are moving from the real world into the virtual world. This is all true and we are in the midst of it. And that's why, I end the book. I don't want to be nostalgic and I don't want to have, even though I'm actually kind of putting this narrative of the rise and then the decline, I know that this is a trope as well, because Habermas, for example, was talking about the decline of coffee house in the 19th century. And for me, 19th century is the heart of that, right? So people have been talking about this decline forever, and who knows? Maybe people will be tired of the digital virtual world. Maybe people will become more revolutionary. And obviously there are people with fire who, want to change. So I think this is open. We don't know where the future. I actually spoke to some people who are much younger than me, and they read the book and they said, we have this thing where we use virtual, we have this community. So, okay, where is this community? How is it's by the internet, of course, it's all over the world, and we use the technology and we meet but then after we meet and we establish that, we need a physical place. And where is it? It's in the coffee house.
So there's hope for the coffee house.
Yeah.
You kind of preempted my next question earlier, but I'd like you to focus a bit more on that. It is really about the difference between the old and the new world in the case studies that you cover. The fact that in the old world it all ended very tragically and rather abruptly, and in the new world, as you say, it kind of died out and still, to an extent, continues to this day. How does this, the tragic and not so tragic circumstances of the way it ended affect your exploration in retrospect? What do they tell about the difference between the case studies, the old and the new world?
Yeah, okay. In all these places, coffee houses existed amidst huge changes and conflicts and, people moved. The reason why people moved and immigrated from one place to another, it was often painful, and it's not just like this kind of traveling. People travel and they decide, okay, let's leave Europe and move to America because, they wanted to do it. They needed to do it. They were refugees. But then what happened, even with World War I, was such a shock. And I think if you read the book carefully, the European chapters, you see that what happens between the wars is very different from what happened before. You see the tensions that I mentioned before that always existed becoming so strong, so intense, right? And then World War II happened, and there's a feeling that European culture is ending. The world of the cafe is ending. Of course, you have people like Stefan Zweig and other people that they use it really as a kind of the world of yesterday, that, this is the death of Europe, this is the, right? And then they try to recreate it wherever they go. And these recreations often don't really work, especially for those people who were so connected to Vienna, to Berlin, you have all these tragic stories, right? Like Alzheimer's Schiele walking in Jerusalem, or other people walking in Tel Aviv, and like, where are the coffee houses? Or all these people saying, you can't have coffee houses in New York because New York doesn't have that kind of, but then of course they are, and Jews are meeting there, right? When we move to New York and to Tel Aviv, you have these people who create a New York style, Lower East Side style coffee houses. You have Tel Aviv and Jaffa style of coffee houses, and it doesn't die with any decisive moment. That didn't happen something like that. Suddenly, Jewish culture was obliterated from these cities. You don't have the sense of World War II as the end of Europe. But it's more subtle,
It's still there, though.
It's still there in a sense that this particular world, and again, we don't want to be nostalgic about it. Appelfeld, which I mentioned, he says it in the most, he loves coffee houses, and he says explicitly that one of the reasons why he was attracted to them in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv was because it reminded him of Europe. But then he says, don't be nostalgic about it, because these people were refugees, right? But then it really ends in the 60s and 70s, because this sense of Jewish culture that is really dependent on the migration, and people in Tel Aviv and in New York become too much in the place itself. In New York, they move away. They live in the Upper West Side. They have huge apartments. They don't need coffee houses anymore.
If they have a lot of money.
Yeah. In Tel Aviv, when Chatzkel, and Kassit and this whole generation dies, suddenly you see a change and a new generation of Israelis who maybe don't need
Maybe we're not wandering
don't...
Jews anymore. We don't need these places of refuge.
Right. I mean, that's definitely part of it. That's definitely...
Shucks. On that note, I'll let you guys think about that. Professor Shachar Pinsker has been talking about his recent book, A Rich Brew. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us the good, bad, the ugly. We take all kinds of critique.
Especially the ugly.
You can support us as well by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews, and please also consider liking us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.